The air in Frank Miller's showroom in the spring of '72 was thick with the smell of ambition. It was a chemical cocktail of fresh green paint, curing rubber, and the sharp, clean scent of vinyl seats that had never known the sweat of a summer's day. Sunlight streamed through the massive plate glass windows, glinting off the hoods of a dozen brand-new John Deere tractors, each one a monument to progress, a promise of an easier life. In the center of the floor, like a king on its throne, sat the prize of the collection, a John Deere 4430, its sound guard cab looking more like the cockpit of a spaceship than a piece of farm equipment. Arthur Jensen ran a calloused hand over the cool, perfect fender. He was a man shaped by the land he worked, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, his hands thick and capable. At 42, he moved with the quiet economy of someone who never wasted a motion or a dollar. He tapped the thick, tinted glass of the cab door. Inside, he could see the plush seat, the array of levers and gauges, and the factory-installed 8-track tape player. It was a different world from the open operator's station of his own 1968 John Deere 4020. "She's a beauty, isn't she, Art?" Frank Miller slid up beside him, smelling of coffee and aftershave. Frank was 10 years younger, with a smile that was a little too quick and eyes that were always calculating angles. He'd inherited the dealership from his father, a man Art had respected. But Frank ran things differently. Old Man Miller sold you a machine. Frank Miller sold you a monthly payment. "It's a lot of tractor, Frank," Art said, his voice a low rumble. "A lot of glass to break." Frank chuckled, a smooth, practiced sound. "That's tempered safety glass, Art, and look at this." He swung the heavy door open, releasing a puff of climate-controlled air. "Air conditioning, heat, a radio. You can farm in a dress shirt in this thing. Think of the hours you'll save, the comfort. You put in a 12-hour day on that old 4020 of yours, you know you've been working. In this, you'll feel fresh as a daisy." Art didn't doubt it. He'd felt the familiar ache in his bones after a long day of spring tillage, his ears ringing from the constant bark of his 40-20s diesel engine. But comfort came at a price, and it was a price that wasn't posted on the window sticker. "What's the horsepower on this?" Art asked, mostly to be polite. 125 at the PTO, Frank said, his chest puffing out. "That's a full 25 more than your 4020. You could pull a 6-bottom plow through that clay on your North 80 without even breaking a sweat. You'd get your planting done a week earlier." Art nodded slowly, looking past the big new tractor at his own truck parked outside. It was a 1965 Ford F100, faded blue, a few dings in the fender, but the engine, a 352 V8 he'd rebuilt himself, ran like a top. He'd paid cash for it 6 years ago, just like he'd paid cash for his 4020, buying it slightly used from a farmer who was retiring. Every piece of iron on his place, from the Farmall Super M his dad had bought new in '53 to the old New Holland baler, was his. The bank didn't own a single bolt. "I don't know, Frank," Art said, stepping back from the tractor. "It's a fine machine, but the 4020 does the job." Frank's smile tightened. "Doing the job isn't enough anymore, Art. This is the new age of farming. We're feeding the world. Efficiency is the name of the game. That old stuff, it's holding you back. You're leaving money on the table." He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "Look, I can make you a deal. Trade in the 4020. We're giving top dollar for them. And the financing? Interest rates are low. We can stretch the payments out. You'll barely even feel it. The extra yield from getting your crops in on time will more than cover the note." Just then, the bell over the showroom door jingled. Dale Peterson walked in, his face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. Dale farmed the half-section that bordered Art's place to the west. He was a good neighbor, but he had an appetite for new things. "Frank, is she ready?" Dale boomed, his eyes locked on a gleaming 44-430, identical to the one Art was looking at. "Ready and waiting, Dale," Frank said, turning his back on Art completely. "Just need you to sign the last of the paperwork in the office." "You're really doing it, Dale?" Art asked. Dale grinned, clapping Art on the shoulder. "Heck yes I am, Art. Time to step into the 70s. My boy Jimmy can't wait to run it. He says that old Farmall 806 of ours is for the birds. No AC." He looked at Art, a hint of pity in his eyes. "Frank can fix you up with one too. It's the future." Art just shook his head slightly. "Good luck with it, Dale." He watched Dale and Frank disappear into the office, their laughter echoing in the big metal building. He looked at the massive tractor one last time. It represented a choice, a fork in the road. One path was smooth, paved with borrowed money and the promise of ease and efficiency. The other was the path he was on, rocky, steep, and solitary. But every inch of it was his own. He knew which one he had to take. He turned and walked out, the jingle of the bell announcing his departure. The spring air felt clean and honest after the artificial atmosphere of the showroom. He climbed into his old Ford, the familiar squeak of the seat a comforting sound. He turned the key, and the big V8 rumbled to life. As he pulled out onto the gravel road, he saw Dale through the office window, pen in hand, signing his future over to the bank. A knot formed in Art's stomach, a mixture of stubborn pride and a deep, unsettling fear that maybe, just maybe, he was the one making the mistake. Before we get into the long years of hardship that followed, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever stood your ground on a principle, a belief you held deep in your gut, even when the whole world, your friends, your neighbors, the so-called experts, called you a fool for it? Let me know down in the comments below, because that's exactly the cross Art Jensen chose to bear as he drove his paid-for truck away from that dealership in 1972, heading toward a storm nobody else seemed to see coming. The years that followed were a testament to sweat and steel. While Dale Peterson's new 4430 purred across his fields, its air-conditioned cab a cool oasis in the sweltering Iowa summers, Art wrestled with his old iron. He kept the 40-20, his main horse, in immaculate shape. Every winter it was parked in the machine shed, where he'd drain the fluids, check the injectors, and tune the diesel engine until it sang a song only he could understand. But machines, no matter how well cared for, have a way of testing a man. The test came in the spring of 1975. The frost had just left the ground, and the black earth was finally ready to be worked. Art was pulling his 24-foot field cultivator, making the first pass to break up the winter-packed soil. He was on the back 40, the farthest point from the house, when he felt it. Not a bang, not a clatter, but a sickening lurch, a sudden lack of power from the wheels to the ground. The engine roared, but the tractor slowed to a crawl and then stopped. He knew instantly. The power shift transmission, a marvel of its time but a bear to work on, had given up the ghost. A cold dread washed over him. He could see Dale, a green speck in the distance, already making his second pass, his new tractor and wider implement eating up the acres. For Art, the season had just ground to a halt. Calling Frank Miller for a service truck was out of the question. The bill would be astronomical, and the lecture about the folly of running old equipment would be free of charge. There was only one way. He walked the 1.5 miles back to the farmstead, the mud sucking at his boots, his mind already disassembling the tractor piece by piece. For the next 2 weeks, the machine shed became his entire world. He started by draining the 30 gallons of high-guard transmission fluid, the lifeblood of the machine, into clean barrels. Then came the heavy work. Using a chain hoist suspended from a thick oak beam, he supported the engine. He unbolted the fuel tank and the operator's platform, carefully labeling every wire and hydraulic line with masking tape and a grease pencil. Finally, with a series of creaks and groans from the steel, he used 2 heavy floor jacks to split the tractor in half, rolling the rear section, the transmission, differential, and final drives away from the engine. The machine shed, filled with the pungent metallic smell of old gear oil. There, inside the massive cast-iron housing, was the planetary gear set that had failed. A clutch pack was fried, the plates warped and blackened from heat and slippage. It was a mess. A trip to the John Deere dealership confirmed his fears. The parts alone would cost over $1,000, money he didn't have to spare. Frank Miller saw him at the parts counter and couldn't resist. Having some trouble with that classic, Art? You know, we've got a brand new 4630 on the lot. We could have you back in the field by tomorrow. Art clenched his jaw. Just need the parts, Frank. Suit yourself, Frank shrugged. But that clock's ticking. Every day you're not in the field is money lost. Art left with a price list, but not the parts. He spent the next 2 days on the phone, the old black rotary dial clicking with each number. He called every salvage yard in a 3-state radius. Finally, a gruff voice from a yard in southern Minnesota said he had a 4020 that had been wrecked in a fire. The transmission, he thought, was probably okay. Art was in his Ford F-100 before the sun was up the next morning, a toolbox and a $100 bill in his pocket. The salvage yard was a graveyard of rusting iron, a place where good machines came to die. But for Art, it was a treasure trove. He found the burnt-out tractor, its paint blistered and its tires melted. But the transmission housing was intact. He spent 6 hours in the mud and grease, wrestling the parts he needed out of the wreck. He paid the man $75 and drove home, victorious. The reassembly was a slow, painstaking process. He cleaned every gear, replaced every seal, and meticulously restacked the clutch plates. His knuckles were raw, his back was a knot of pain, and his wife, Mary, brought him his meals in the shed, her face etched with worry. The neighbors were talking. The coffee shop buzz was that Art Jensen was finally done for. His equipment had failed him, and he was too stubborn or too broke to fix it. Dale Peterson drove by one evening, slowing his new pickup to look at the dissected tractor in Art's shed before shaking his head and speeding off. Finally, the day came. The tractor was back in one piece. The fluids were filled. With a prayer, Art climbed onto the seat, turned the key, and pushed the starter. The diesel engine coughed to life, billowing black smoke before settling into its familiar, rhythmic idle. He carefully moved the power shift lever. The tractor eased forward, then backward. It was working. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He had done it. He was 3 weeks behind schedule, but he would get his crop in. That year, the corn grew tall, and when he harvested it with his old but reliable International combine, he made enough to pay his bills and put a little aside. He hadn't made a fortune, but he hadn't paid a dime of interest either. He was still standing on his own 2 feet. The late 70s were a golden age for farmers who were willing to take a risk. The government, under Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts, was telling them to get big or get out, to plant fence-row to fence-row. Grain exports to the Soviet Union were booming, and commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn that had been $2 a bushel was suddenly selling for $3, then $3.50. Land values, which had been stable for a generation, exploded. A piece of ground that was worth $800 an acre in 1972 was suddenly selling for $2,000, then $3,000 an acre. It was a heady time, a time of seemingly limitless prosperity. For men like Dale Peterson, it was validation. His gamble on the new 4430 had paid off. The increased efficiency allowed him to farm more acres, and the high grain prices made his payments seem manageable. He became Frank Miller's star pupil. In 1977, when the 160-acre Henderson farm came up for sale, Dale didn't hesitate. He went to the bank, leveraged his existing, now more valuable land, and bought it. To work the new ground, he traded his 4430 for a brand new, top-of-the-line John Deere 4840, a four-wheel drive monster with jewels all around, and a massive 7/20 turbo combine to go with it. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, a true empire by local standards. He drove a new silver Cadillac, and his wife got a new station wagon every 2 years. Dale and Art's relationship grew strained. What was once a friendly rivalry became a source of tension. "You're missing the boat, Art," Dale would say, leaning against Art's faded Ford pickup at the co-op. "You could have bought that Henderson quarter. You've got the best ground in the county, but you're thinking too small. You've got to expand to survive." Art would just nod. "I'm surviving just fine, Dale." "Surviving isn't living," Dale would laugh. "Look at this." He'd gesture to his new equipment, his vast fields. "This is living." Art saw it differently. He saw the mountain of debt that came with it all. He saw the way Frank Miller and the bankers clapped Dale on the back. They weren't celebrating Dale's success. They were celebrating his compliance. Art had good years too. The high prices meant his modest yields brought in more money than ever before. In 1978, he had his most profitable year on record. Mary hoped they might finally take a real vacation, maybe see the Grand Canyon. But Art had other plans. He took the profits and drove to the Farmers National Bank in town. He walked past the young loan officers in their crisp suits and went straight to the back office of Mr. Henderson, the bank president, a man in his late 60s who had known Art's father. "Arthur," Mr. Henderson said, gesturing to a chair. "Good to see you. I trust the harvest was good." "It was, sir," Art said, taking a seat. "I'm here to pay off the last of my operating note." He slid a check across the polished desk. Mr. Henderson looked at it, then at Art over the top of his spectacles. He stamped the note, "Paid in full," with a heavy, satisfying thud, and handed it to Art. "Congratulations, son," he said, his voice quiet. "You're a rare breed these days. Most of your neighbors are borrowing more, not less." "I know," Art said. "I've got another check here. I'd like to put it into some certificates of deposit." Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "CDs? Art, the interest rates on these are decent. But with inflation running the way it is, and land values, are you sure you wouldn't be better off buying that 80 acres south of you? It's for sale." "I'm sure, sir," Art said firmly. "I like the feeling of sleeping at night." The old banker smiled, a genuine, knowing smile. "Your father was the same way, a wise man. He'd be proud of you." When word got out at the coffee shop that Art Jensen had a pile of cash sitting in CDs instead of buying more land or new iron, he became a laughingstock. "Can you believe it?" they'd say. "He's scared of money, letting it sit in the bank while the rest of us are building something." The fall of 1979 was warm and dry, perfect for the harvest. Art worked from dawn till dusk, his old IH combine chugging along, slowly, steadily eating its way through his fields of corn. One evening, he was in the machine shed, working late by the light of a single bare bulb. He was greasing the fittings on his old Farmall Super M, the tractor he used for odd jobs, the one his father had been so proud of. The air was cool and smelled of grease, diesel, and the rich scent of the earth. On a dusty shelf, a small transistor radio was crackling out the news. The announcer's voice was grim, talking about hostages in Iran, long lines at gas stations, and something called the prime interest rate. The Federal Reserve, he said, had raised it again, trying to combat runaway inflation. The new rate was a staggering 15%. Art stopped turning the grease gun. 15%. He thought of Dale, of all the other farmers who had borrowed heavily, their loans tied to that prime rate. Their interest payments would double, maybe triple overnight. A cold wind rattled the tin siding of the shed, the first sign of a coming storm. Art walked to the big sliding door and looked out into the darkness. Across the section, he could see a blaze of lights moving across the hillside. It was Dale's new 4840 and his 7720 combine, working late to bring in the last of his massive crop. The machines looked powerful, invincible, like beacons of prosperity in the vast, dark landscape. But as Art stood there, in the quiet of his own debt-free farm, a deep chill settled into his bones. He knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath his feet, that those brilliant lights weren't beacons. They were the lights of a train, roaring down the tracks in the dead of night, heading straight for a cliff, and nobody on board could even see it coming. The spring of 1980 arrived with a false promise, a few gentle rains that greened the pastures and softened the earth just enough for planting. Art got his corn in the ground with the old 4020, its repaired transmission shifting smoothly, a quiet testament to his winter's labor. Dale, with his colossal 4840 and a 24-row planter, was finished in half the time, his cab a dust-free bubble of air-conditioned comfort. But then, the sky shut off. May bled into a hot, dry June. The sun rose each morning, not as a welcome friend, but as a white-hot adversary in a brassy, cloudless sky. The corn leaves, which should have been broad and deep green, curled inward by noon, a plant's silent scream for water. The ground, once black and forgiving, baked into a concrete-like crust, cracking in jagged patterns across the fields. Ponds shrank, their edges receding to reveal muddy, cracked earth. The air was thick with a fine dust that coated everything in a gritty, tarn film. Art watched his crops struggle, his heart aching with a helplessness only a farmer can know. He did what he could, using his old cultivator to break up the crust and preserve what little moisture was left, working in the cooler hours of the early morning and late evening. His fuel costs were minimal. His equipment, simple and mechanical, chugged along without complaint. The strain was far more visible on Dale Peterson's side of the fence. The big, heavy equipment he ran compacted the dry soil, and the powerful engines drank diesel at an alarming rate as they fought the hard ground. One afternoon in early July, Art saw the 4840 sitting idle in the middle of a field, its hazard lights blinking like a wounded animal. An hour later, Frank Miller's gleaming white service truck pulled in. Art watched through his binoculars as a young mechanic in a clean uniform fussed with the engine, shaking his head. The tractor didn't move for 2 days. The coffee shop talk was that a single electronic fuel injection module had failed. The part had to be flown in from the factory in Waterloo, and the final bill, including labor, was over $2,000. The drought was only the first blow. In Washington, politicians were playing games with the world's food supply. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union, meant to be a political statement, slammed the door on the American farmer's biggest customer. The price of corn, which had been buoyed by years of strong exports, collapsed. It fell from over $3 a bushel to barely $2, then kept dropping. For Art, it was a painful hit. His yields were already going to be cut in half by the drought. Now, The price he'd get for what little he did harvest wouldn't even cover the cost of production for most farmers. But Art's costs were different. He had no payments. His fertilizer had been bought and paid for with cash from the previous year. His only major expense was fuel, and he used less than anyone. He would lose money, but he had his savings, the CDs he'd been mocked for, to see him through the winter. For Dale, the situation was catastrophic. He had a massive operating loan based on a projected yield and a price of $3 a bushel. Now, he had half the crop and was getting half the price. The math was brutal and unforgiving. He began to look haunted. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, grim set to his jaw. Art would see him walking his fields at dusk, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The silver Cadillac stayed in the garage. He drove his dusty farm truck everywhere. The first real crack in Frank Miller's empire appeared that fall. He'd always sponsored the biggest tent at the county fair, filled with shiny new equipment. That year, the tent was half its usual size, and the machines on display were smaller, more practical models. Frank himself was there, but his usual glad-handing energy was gone. His smile was forced, his eyes darted around nervously, and he spent more time talking to the local banker than to farmers. He had built a brand-new 8-bay service shop behind the dealership the year before, a massive expansion financed to the hilt. Now, his customers couldn't afford the routine maintenance, let alone the major repairs his complex new machines often required. The new shop stood mostly empty, a monument to an optimism that had vanished as quickly as a summer rain on hot pavement. One sweltering August afternoon, Art was in his shed, grinding a new edge on the blades of his sickle mower. The drone of the grinder was the only sound, besides the buzzing of flies. A shadow fell across the doorway. It was Dale. He looked terrible. His face was pale beneath his tan, and his hands were trembling slightly. "Art," he said, his voice raspy. "My combine. The 7720. The main hydraulic pump went out. Frank's man was out. Says it's a $5,000 job, parts and labor, and he can't get to it for 2 weeks." He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. "The bank called this morning. Said they're re-evaluating my line of credit." Art shut off the grinder. The silence that followed was heavy. He looked at Dale, a man who had everything, who represented the future, and saw only fear. "I've got that old International 915, Art said quietly. "It's not much, just a 6-row head on it. But it runs. You're welcome to use it to get your beans out when they're ready." Dale stared at him, his eyes welling up. He looked at the old simple machines in Art's shed, the tools hanging neatly on the walls, the evidence of a lifetime of making do, of fixing, of self-reliance. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded, a single jerky motion, and turned and walked away. Art watched him go, feeling not a shred of triumph, only a deep, profound sorrow for his neighbor, a man who had been sold a dream that had just become a nightmare. The winter of 1981 was bleak, not just because of the snow and cold, but because of the chilling economic wind that swept across the heartland. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, had cranked the prime interest rate to an unimaginable 21%. For farmers carrying heavy debt, it was a death sentence. Loan payments that were once manageable suddenly became impossible burdens. The letters from the bank, once friendly reminders, became terse, legalistic demands. The landscape began to change. Red and white auction signs, stark against the winter snow, sprouted like bitter weeds along the gravel roads. They appeared at the ends of lanes that led to farms that had been in the same family for 100 years. Every Saturday, a grim pilgrimage of farmers would gather at another neighbor's farmstead, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear, wondering who would be next. They were there to witness the public dismemberment of a life's work, to pick over the bones of a broken dream. In March, the sign went up at the end of Dale Peterson's lane. The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a raw wind that cut through the thickest coat. The farmyard was packed with trucks. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a practiced, emotionless cadence, stood on a flatbed trailer, his chant echoing off the silent buildings. Dale's life was being sold off, piece by piece. The household goods went first, then the tools from the shop, each item held up for the crowd. Art stood at the back, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, feeling like an intruder at a funeral. Then came the iron. The big 7720 combine, its hydraulic pump still not fixed, sold for a fraction of its value to a salvage dealer. The massive disc, the 24-row planter, all the symbols of Dale's ambition, went for pennies on the dollar to opportunistic buyers from out of state. Finally, they brought out the John Deere 4840. It was caked in mud, a tired giant that had been run hard and put away wet. "All right, boys, here she is," the auctioneer bellowed. "The big horse, four-wheel drive, jewels all around. Who'll start the bidding at 50,000? Silence. The crowd just stared. 50,000 was a fantasy. A year ago, maybe. Not today. 40,000. More silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. 30. Give me 30,000, boys. It's worth that for scrap. A hand went up. 15. A voice called out. The auctioneer seized on it. I've got 15. Now who'll give me 20? 20,000 for this powerhouse. The bidding crawled upward in painful, small increments. Art watched Dale, who was standing near the house with his wife and son, his face a stony, expressionless mask. He wasn't watching the tractor. He was staring at the horizon, as if he could see his entire future disappearing over it. The tractor, the pride of his fleet, the machine that was supposed to guarantee his success, sold for $26,000 to a large corporate farm from Nebraska. Next, they auctioned off the land itself, the 160-acre Henderson farm that Dale had leveraged everything to buy. Art felt a pull. It was good land, bordering his own. He thought of Dale's boast years ago. You're missing the boat, Art. The banker, representing the bank that now owned the property, started the bidding. It was low, shockingly low. Land values had collapsed just as surely as crop prices. No one had the cash or the credit to buy. Art felt Mary's hand on his arm. He looked at her, and she nodded. He had talked to old Mr. Henderson at the bank the week before. His CDs had matured. He raised his hand. His bid was firm and clear, and it hung in the cold air, unchallenged. A few minutes later, the auctioneer slammed his gavel down. "Sold to Arthur Jensen!" A murmur went through the crowd. Art Jensen, the man who never bought anything, had just bought the Henderson farm. He didn't feel victorious. He felt a heavy responsibility settle onto his shoulders. The final collapse came a month later. Art was driving into town for supplies when he saw the sign on the front door of Miller's John Deere. It was a simple, typed notice from the bank, announcing the dealership was closed, its assets to be liquidated. The plate-glass windows of the showroom were dark and empty. The rows of new tractors were gone, repossessed by the company. Frank Miller's dream, built on easy credit and the gospel of get big or get out, had shattered into 1,000 pieces. Art just shook his head and drove on. He had survived. His stubbornness, his refusal to bow to the pressures of the modern world had been his salvation. While his neighbors' empires crumbled into dust, his small, solid foundation, built of paid-for steel and hard-won self-sufficiency, remained standing. The spring that followed the auctions was a quiet, somber time. The fields that had once belonged to Dale Peterson and others were now either rented out by the banks or farmed by the few survivors who had managed to weather the storm. The coffee shop, once a place of boisterous talk about new equipment and record yields, was now filled with hushed conversations about interest rates and foreclosure notices. The laughter was gone. The men who had once mocked Art for his caution now looked at him with a new respect. They'd stop by his machine shed, their hats in their hands, not to borrow a tool, but to ask for advice. "Art, my old case is making a funny noise in the rear end. You think it's a bearing? Or, how'd you manage to keep that old combine running all these years?" He never gloated. He'd wipe the grease from his hands with a rag, walk over to their tractor, and listen with a patient ear. He'd offer his diagnosis, suggest a way to fix it without buying expensive new parts, and send them on their way with a renewed sense of hope. He was no longer the crazy old-timer. He was the wise man on the hill. One morning in May, as Art was getting the old Farmall Super M ready to cultivate the new ground he'd bought, a dusty, unfamiliar car pulled into his lane. A man got out, thinner and older-looking than Art remembered. It was Frank Miller. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by worn jeans and a faded work shirt. His face was etched with lines of worry. "Art," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its old sales pitch swagger. "Heard you were looking for some help with the new ground and all." Art stopped what he was doing and looked Frank square in the eye. He could have said 1,000 things. He could have reminded him of the lectures in the showroom, of the condescending smiles, of the pressure to sign on the dotted line. But he saw in Frank's eyes the same look of desperation he'd seen in Dale's. He saw a man who had lost everything. "I can always use a good hand," Art said simply, "especially one who knows his way around a John Deere. The clutch on the 4020 needs adjusting. You can start there." Frank looked stunned, then a wave of relief washed over his face. "Thank you, Art," he whispered. "Thank you." Frank Miller worked for Art for the next 5 years. He was a good mechanic, and working on the old simple machines seemed to reconnect him with the honest principles his own father had built the dealership on. He never tried to sell Art anything again. Art also made a point to find Dale Peterson, who had taken a job at the grain elevator in town, loading trucks. One evening, Art found him there, covered in corn dust, his face grim. "Dale," Art said, getting straight to the point, "I'm not getting any younger, and I've got more ground than I can handle now. I was wondering if you'd be interested in cash renting the old Henderson place from me. On favorable terms, get you back on your feet." Dale stared at him, speechless. "Art? Why? After everything?" "Because you're a good farmer, Dale," Art said. "You just got caught in a bad time. The land needs a good farmer." The decade turned. The farm crisis slowly eased, leaving deep scars on the community, but also a hard-earned wisdom. Frank Miller eventually saved up enough to open a small, independent repair shop in a nearby town, specializing in older equipment. He became known for his honesty and fair prices. Dale Peterson rented the Henderson place from Art for years, farming it with second-hand equipment he bought for cash. He never borrowed another dollar from a bank, and he and Art became close friends, bonded by the shared memory of the storm they had weathered from opposite sides. One warm autumn afternoon in the late 1980s, Art stood on his back porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. He was older now, his hair more grey than brown, his movements a little stiffer, but his eyes were clear and calm. In the machine shed, his son, Mark, a young man of 20 with his father's capable hands, was working on the 4020. The sound of a wrench tightening a bolt, a clear metallic ring, carried on the breeze. Mark came out of the shed, wiping his greasy hands on a red rag. "Dad, I think the injectors are just about timed right. She's running smoother than ever." "Good work," Art said with a proud smile. He looked out across his fields at the neat rows of harvested corn stubble stretching toward the horizon. He owned it all. Every acre, every building, every machine. The bank didn't own a single bolt. "You know, son," Art said, his voice thoughtful. "Some people look at that old tractor and all they see is old iron. They see something that's slow, uncomfortable, inefficient." He took a sip of his coffee, the silence punctuated by the caw of a distant crow. "When I look at it," he continued, "I see freedom. That tractor represents a choice, the choice to own your work, to own your life. This land, this farm, it's not just dirt and buildings. It's a legacy. But a legacy built on debt is just a house of cards, waiting for the wind to blow. A legacy built on what you own, what you can fix with your own 2 hands. That's a foundation. That's something that lasts." Mark nodded, understanding. He had grown up hearing the stories of the farm crisis, of the neighbors who had lost everything. He had seen the quiet dignity with which his father had endured and prevailed. He looked at the 40C20, its faded green paint glowing in the late afternoon sun. It wasn't just a machine to him, either. It was a teacher. It was a symbol of his family's survival. "Let's fire her up," Mark said. "I want to hear her run." A few moments later, the familiar, powerful bark of the 4020's diesel engine echoed across the farmstead. It wasn't the quiet hum of a new machine, insulated and distant. It was a loud, honest, mechanical roar. The sound of pistons and steel working in concert, the sound of power that belonged to them, and them alone. Art stood on the porch, listening. It was more than just an engine. It was the steady, reliable heartbeat of his farm, a testament to the stubborn man who chose the hard, right path, and the enduring truth that the storm can only take what you've allowed it to own.